Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to have all of you here in this webinar promoted by the Innovation and Regional Development course at the Institute of Economics at the University of Campinas. Well, before starting our webinar, let me briefly introduce our guest, Professor Nicola Pontarolo. Professor Pontarolo is assistant professor at the University of Brescia, Italy, and got his PhD in economics and finance at the University of Verona. Well, before settling in Brescia, he was assistant professor at the Catholic University of the North in Chile, was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Milan Bicocca in Italy, and statistical officer at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Spain. In addition, he was also a visiting professor at the University of Ecuador, in University of Cuenca, and Kazakhstan, Suleiman Demirel University. His research interests focus on the study of regional resilience, subnational economic growth, and the geography of discontent. Professor Pontarolo has published extensively in many well-known international journals, such as Regional Studies, Journal of Regional Science, papers in regional science, and so on. Well, the topic of his presentation today is regional resilience from a theoretical perspective to an empirical analysis. Professor Pontarolo, thank you very much for your acceptance, for accepting our invitation, and you are very welcome. The audience is all yours. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Renato. Thank everyone for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me. It's a pleasure because I'm always happy to share ideas, get new ideas, learn something, and if I can show you something interesting and that can be useful for your research or that helps you for having new ideas, etc., etc. So it's always a pleasure having these opportunities, in particular in a big and important country like Brazil, where I hope there will be, this will be the first meeting, the first step for a collaboration for developing something together. In this view, I made my presentation that, as you said right now, is about resilience. And I would like to stress at the end of the presentation, I anticipate what can be used in the case of Brazil, what elements of my presentation could be useful, could be implemented in the Brazilian case and more in general in the Latin American case. So if I share the screen right now, I share, please let me know if you can see my screen. If you, Mauricio, Renato, can you see? Yes,
yeah,
okay. Oh, wonderful. So I make this small. So this is the title of my presentation. It's based basically on a research that is already published, but on a really interesting field, which is a very big field, which is resilience. Resilience is a noun, a word which has many notions, and there are many phases of resilience. And I will show you some of these phases, and I will try to summarize them also. So you can see here my email, and below the paper that which I'm basing my presentation. So we have to start speaking about resilience, regional resilience. The pioneering study about that is by Martin, 2012, which where the Martin, please interrupt me in any moment if you have any question or if some question comes into the chat that I cannot see. Please, Renato, Maurizio, interrupt me in every moment. So I was saying, what is resilience? According to Martin, resilience has 4 dimensions. The first is identified as resistance. So it is the sensitivity to regional output and employment to exogenous shocks. And the resistance determines what? The demand for public policies. So is the sensitivity, how much? Recovery, how much is affected, okay, employment or output. The recovery measure, on the other hand, is widely used in literature and measure what? How fast the region bounced back from a negative shock, how much a region is able to recover from that shock. Then we have reorientation that concerns the extent to which a region changes after a shock by switching, for example, its economic sectoral composition. So this is much more an evolutionary perspective. Then we have the renewal, the ability of a region to renew its growth path. So to change, to start a new one. This is the theory. Now let's see, there are in literature some applications about the first, regarding the first and the second points in particular. We will see now, however, something different. We will see how we will contribute to the literature, trying to sum up these 4 perspectives. And I will try to tell you why it's so important to sum up sometimes, even in economics, regional science, or in social science in general. So what do? We're going to introduce a new indicator, but before of that, we introduce a new framework regarding resilience. So we identify the main dimension of regional resilience, making reference to the life cycle theory we will see in a moment. Then, after identifying these various dimensions, we sum up, we synthesize these dimensions into a single indicator, which we called Regional Economic Resilience Indicator. This is quite interesting. The paper is quite new because it has been published it's 2020, but for the first time before being introduced in a issue was published in 2018 and has received quite few citations because trying to transmit a complex message with a simple tool, a synthetic indicator, we will see, is a difficult exercise, but that could be very interesting and useful from both a theoretical point of view, from a policy perspective, and also from a scientific perspective. So we use our Regional Economic Resilience Indicator, we label that RERI, that is able to categorize the resilience degree of European regions. Then we analyze the spatial pattern of this indicator, we will see with some methodological tools that we will explore together. And then we could suggest some policy instruments giving our results, on the basis of our results. So let's go step by step. So the point that we ask ourselves, basically, okay, 4 dimensions were identified, but no one synthesized these theme, synthesized resilience, all these dimensions into a single indicator that could be useful. You can lose information, but gain also information. And we will see, I repeat, how. So our aim is to explore 3 economic variables GDP per capita, employment, and productivity, which are the ingredients, if you want, of the share play decomposition, and synthesize these three different dimensions into a single indicator. Okay. We, as I anticipated you, rely on the life cycle theory. We borrow this life cycle theory and we identified what? Different steps of a resilience capacity building process. Why? Because we, me and my co-author and me, we thought that resilience is not just something that happened due to a shock, but it's something like a process. So we are basically acquiring resilience capacity as a country or as a region because we are implementing some policies, for example, that allows us to react well to a shock. If you didn't implement any policy, it's not possible to react to a shock, or very much more difficult. On the other way, if you implemented some policies, you can. And this is a process then. It's not something that just happened and we measure what happens after the shock. So we thought about this, the life cycle of resilience, in this way. Going directly to our figure, this is the life cycle that we thought about, but this is the classical life cycle theory that we know from the products, or etc., economic growth, blah, blah, blah. But we try to decompose these into some pieces. So we have, first of all, the introduction, then the growth, maturity, and then renewal or decline after a shock. Let's see one by one. So introduction. So the introduction is characterized by what? By the increasing returns to scale for the economy, a moment in which we accumulate resilience capacity, a moment in which we can be able to escape from the so-called poverty trap. So a moment in which the economy, the regional economies in this case, are quite prosperous and are growing quietly fast. Then we have the growth stage. So a moment in which, after the introductory stage, the growth benefits from what? From the economy of scales developed in the first stage. So there are innovation processes, there are spillover effects that are going to increase over time. So we are going to have a higher productivity, enhanced skills, and all these processes, innovation, spillover, etc., determine what? The speed of the growth process. Okay, and then the slope of the resilience capacity building process. So how much we are able to accumulate resilience capacity. Okay. Then this phase can lead regions or country to a certain level of resilience capacity. Then we have the maturity stage, which is this phase immediately before the shock, where the growth capacity building is close to the steady state. So the objective is to maintain the growth, okay, and to maintain the adaptive and coping capacity accumulated in the previous stage, okay. And this is specific, this maturity stage, to every region, and specific with respect to the competitive and comparative advantages that we have. Then we have a shock in our resilience life cycle. If we have a shock, two opposite things can happen. We can have a declining stage or a renewal stage, depending on what. We can renew our growth path or decline depending on the resilience capacity accumulated in the previous stages. If we were able to accumulate a good level of resilience capacity, adaptability, etc., then we will be able to recover, to restart our life cycle. So, however, the point is that the first three stages, the introduction, the growth, and maturity, are not observable individually, while the last stage, yes. So we rely on another conceptualization of resilience by Manca et al. 2017, that actually is a paper published in Social Indicators Research, that define the first three stages as a slow burning process. So it's basically a capacity building over time of a region to cope with a shock. And the last stage, which is the decline or renewal, can be observed, and it is called shock wave or dynamic process in this conceptualization from Manca and all. So we define a theoretical framework that can be seen in the perspective introduced by Manca et al., where these authors are taking a broader perspective. They are not going to analyze simply or only economic resilience, but they are analyzing resilience in taking a broader perspective. So we develop this theoretical framework, and now we have to make operationalize to understand how to make practically feasible the measurement of our resilience stages with data. And then I'm going to introduce the case study. The case study is refers to the European Union, and takes the data between 2000 and 2015. Okay, so what's the point of the European Union? You know, more or less, that the European Union now accounts for 27 member states and not 28, because Great Britain is not anymore a member of the European Union. These countries in the European Union are quite different. We have Germany, that we all know that is a very developed country, very efficient. We remember Mercedes or other stuff from Germany. But there are other countries like, I don't know, Romania or Bulgaria, which are relatively poor. We have Germany, which is a very big country in the context of Europe. We have Malta, that is basically a middle city. It's an island. It's super small. So it's a very heterogeneous reality. So we are going to consider these 28 countries at the time, because United Kingdom was still part, and we are going to consider 271 NUTS2 regions. What are the NUTS2 regions? Are the same administrative, the lower administrative level after the national level. So in Europe, generally, we have, I think, in all the world, or all the countries, we call them with different names, but in Europe, we have countries, regions, provinces, municipalities. This is the scale, from the bigger to the smaller. We are going to analyze regions. These regions are different in shape, different population, we will see in one moment. And for developing our framework, we choose the period 2000-2015. Why? Because we have a slow burning process before the crisis, 2000-2008, and a shock wave when 2009-2015. So we can calculate, we can have two separate periods before and after the crisis. Okay. The other fact is that the crisis in Europe has been quite difficult, different among countries and within countries. Within countries, we have some regions that reacted very well, some regions which are still lagging behind due to this crisis. So we have a very heterogeneous picture. Our key indicator, I anticipated that we use the Shapley decomposition. This is the Shapley decomposition. So GDP per capita can be seen as what? As GDP per employee, productivity, multiplied by what? By employee over population. Okay, so we use these three elements to measure the various phases of the crisis of our life cycle. Why? Think about the reactivity of each of these elements. We can have some regions where productivity is still high, but unemployment is declining. So they could not be perfectly matching. They could not perfectly match all these three indicators. So they could have different time patterns. So taking this into our mind, what do we do? First, we categorize the trends before and the trends after the crisis, and we identified 4 possible dimensions. We have here in this table, I don't know if you see the mouse, however, we have on the x-axis the trend after, on the y-axis the trend before. The dotted line represents the average European, the average European trend before and after. So we rely on what? GDP per capita, A, okay? We compare the trend before and the trend after. We do the same for employment and we do the same for productivity, the elements of our Shapley decomposition. What the quadrants represent? But we start with the easier, the winners. Those regions which were having a trend above the European average before and now, and also after the crisis. We label them winners because they were performing in a better way before and after. So in this quadrant, we have that those regions that have an economic stability and resilience capacity achieved before the shock. Okay, and these in our recalling our theoretical framework, this resilience capacity accumulated before the shock help for reacting well after the shock. So we have the winners. Remember that we have 271 regions. We have different patterns for the 3 different indicators. In particular, employment, we see that regions are lagging, quite lagging, while for GDP per capita and productivity, a fourth, 25% of regions were behaving better and continue to behave better than the average. So we have the inefficient process. Inefficient process means represent those regions that were performing in a good way before, but in a bad way after. So we have that in our recalling our theoretical framework, the growth and resilience capacity building process has not reached in the pre-crisis period the critical mass necessary to recover. So we have not quite a few regions, in particular regarding employment, that were performing well, but before, but not after. Then we have the falling behind. Those regions that were strongly affected by the crisis, but that also before the crisis, they were not performing well. And finally, we have the inherent features. This is quite interesting. These regions were not performing well before the crisis, but they were able to recover very well, to perform in a better way compared to the European average after. So we attributed this capacity to the inherent structural characteristics that contributed to changing past trends. So these regions were having not good performance before, but however, they were accumulating resilience capacity in terms of policies, blah, 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 that make them in a good condition in the sense of reacting to a crisis. So we have a quite heterogeneous picture here. Okay, but this is a first step, a first exploratory step. Then let's go to our indicator, to our regional economic resilience indicator. So we made 3 steps. First, data collection and indicators. We saw that together. Then we have the weighting and aggregation. And then the most interesting part, which is the clustering and spatial analysis. So we, as I already told you, we label slow burning process the process before the crisis. But what elements of this slow burning process we took? Get a look to this. Here we see various, basically our life cycle. We decompose our resilience life cycle into pieces. So in the pre-crisis period, we took what? The mean of the average period regarding each of our 3 elements, our 3 indicators, which represent what? The average level or the steady state level before of the system before the crisis. Then we take the trend of the period before and after the crisis. So the trend before is assumed to be what? The long-run growth trend of a region. And the trend that may continue if the crisis doesn't occur. The trend post-crisis proxies what? The long-run growth trend as a result of the recovery capacity to the crisis. Okay, so average before, trend after, trend before, a trend after, and trend after. Then what are this is the slow burning. Regarding the shock dynamics indicator, we took what? The maximum impact of the crisis between 2009 and 19 compared to the pre-crisis, and the relative change between 2015 and 2008. We took these, the maximum hit, and the recovery, this distance. These are the 5 elements: average before, trend, pre-crisis trend, post-crisis trend, maximum hit, and recovery, that we consider to identify our resilience indicator and to identify our resilience life cycle. Okay, now we have the elements. We have to put them together. We use all of them. We standardize them because we have to use the same scale for all. This is a simple normalization. Then we put them together in an index composite indicator, where the composite indicator in our case is something like this. We have the sum of each of our elements that I recalled before, weighted for something. The point is, how can I choose these weights? There are many ways. We choose weights based on a principal component analysis. So we estimated basically the normalized square loadings, okay? So as the highest loading per variable weights. Basically, we took the loadings that better characterize each variable. However, this is not, I don't speak too much about this because we made a robustness check with an alternative weighting method where we use equal weights. If we use equal weights for all of our indicators, we have a correlation close to 95% with the weights derived by the principal component analysis. And so this is useful to know that our indicator is robust if we change weights. This is something that generally is done. Why? Because if the weights lead if you change the weights and the ranking of the regions change, that's a problem. It means that it's not the indicator the key, but is how you are weighting each one of the indicator. So it means that it's not something objective, but could be something subjective. So it's key to try to make some comparison with different weights. So don't worry about the technicalities here. The important thing is that even if we change the weights, the indicator is basically the same. Okay, so before showing you the indicator, I give you some additional hints on this part about clustering and spatial analysis. Why? Because it's beautiful having a map with a lot of regions with a lot of colors, but there are strategies, there are instruments, tools, statistical tools that allows you to identify patterns, identify trends in space. And this is fundamental because in a map, if you play with a quartile, if you show the decile or quartiles, you can show very different patterns. But you have to use the right instruments, the right statistical instruments to really identify the patterns. And what are these instruments? Two examples are the hierarchical clustering, that is used to identify groups of regions which show similar patterns of resilience in this case. And there are also more explicit tools like the global Moran or the Moran scatter map, we will see, and the local Moran. Two words. What is the global Moran? The global Moran is a measure that tells you it's like a correlation measure, but while correlation correlates two different elements, for example, the wage that we have and the year of schooling, the correlation is positive, so the higher is the level of your education, the higher is the wage, so the correlation will be positive. In the Moran indicator, we have the correlation between what? Between a variable in a specific place in a region and the same variable on the surrounding regions. The super easy example is crime. If you have crime in a region, it's very likely that you will have crime also in the surrounding regions. Okay, so the Moran psi has a value that goes from -1 to 1. If we have 1, we have very defined spatial patterns. In Italy, we have, for example, the north of Italy, which is very rich, the south of Italy, which is quite poor, and it's very, if you look at the data, you see clearly the spatial pattern, so there is a high spatial autocorrelation. On the contrary, -1 means that there is something like chess. So you have regions which are high performing close to others which are not really high performing. The local Moran is a way for identifying a sort of hotspot and cold spot clusters of regions which are performing particularly well or particularly in a bad way. This is, after having spoken a lot, the map of Europe. This is the European Union, and you can see our indicator. The darker colors means that regions have higher resilience capacity. What can we see here? So, at the first look, there is a spatial pattern. Germany, this is Germany, is performing better than Italy or than Spain. But within country, if we look carefully, we see that there are some areas that are performing quite well. Which one? Paris. Paris is a sort of outlier. Madrid, central Spain. This is the capital, Bucharest, the capital of Romania. This is Berlin. So it looks like that there are some areas, some cities, some urban areas, which are performing quite well compared to the context around. So we see here two information. First, there is a core periphery pattern, probably. Then, within countries, there are differences. Here we see some useful statistics that allows us to understand something. For example, we see that, take Germany. In Germany, the average resilience capacity is quite high, and the variability is not so high. In the contrary, in Belgium, is not high if the regional economic resilience indicator has been standardized between 0 and 1. In Belgium is quite low, but the variability is quite high compared to the average. In some regions, some areas, there is no variability. Why? Cyprus is this island. There are no regions, is a single area, okay? In Italy, there are 20 regions, and you see that also in Italy, the variability is quite high. Okay, here we saw something, but here we made 10 classes. Is it really true? Imagine that here, instead of 10, you have 2 classes. Below and above the mean, you will lose a lot of information. But we have to find a way, the way that I showed you before, to identify statistically if there are some patterns. How? This is one way. This is the cluster analysis. We identify 4 clusters, and the clusters show what? We have a core area, another time, of high resilience regions. But we see that high resilience regions are not only Germany, but there are also here, where there is Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, in Romania, the Baltic countries, here where there is the capital of Poland, Warsaw. So we see something more something different compared to the map that we have seen before. But we see that, however, there is a certain degree of concentration around this zone. So there is a core, a first periphery, and the real periphery of Europe. We clearly see a spatial pattern. Periphery regions are, geographical periphery regions are really performing in a worst way. Just to give you some information about this, what you see is the cluster dendrogram. So this is the cluster analysis. Cluster analysis is based on the agglomerative clusters. So we see that the last step is when there is just one cluster, all have the same color. When we do the break where we have the big jumps. Where are the big jumps here? Exactly where we put the dotted line. So here we have the cutoff that identify our cluster. We could cut corresponding to 1.5 and 3 clusters. Yes, we could. Was that a good solution? Probably not. Why? Because here, in the last 2 clusters that you see, there is a big jump. So it's a bit subjective, but not so much subjective, the point where we cut the dendrogram. So this is what we see. However, sorry, this is the other map that I want to show you. I inverted two slides. These are the maps based on our Moran side and local Moran. What do we have here? On the left panel, we have that in red, those regions that are performing with respect to our indicators, to our resilience indicator, which are performing better than the European average, surrounded by other regions which are performing better. We see Germany, Great Britain, and some regions in Poland, and some others. Then we have low-low. Low-low means what? Those regions that are performing less well than the European average, surrounded by other regions that are performing less well than the European average. You see that there are some countries which are quite homogeneous, some other which are not homogeneous. So this is another information. What information? We have some countries which are very heterogeneous within, and other countries which are very homogeneous within. This is a good news. This is a good news, and important news. Then we have some border regions, which are these, the low-I, these regions that we see here. Low-I, what does it mean? It means that are regions that are performing less well than the European average, surrounded by other regions that are performing better. So these are the border regions. But the most interesting is the last, the low-I, which are the regions which are performing less well, surrounded by other. It's repeated 2 times. This is a typo. This is high-low. These are, for example, the capitals. The capitals, Madrid, is performing better and is surrounded by other regions which are performing in a worst with respect to European average. But we are also interested in understanding if there are hotspot and cold spot. What are them? We see on the right panel. Here we have those regions that among the best performing, surrounded by others which are well performing, are a sort of hotspot, are a sort of outlier. So among the best, they are the best of the best. And at the reverse, here in these blue regions, we have those that are performing in a bad way, surrounded by other regions which are not performing well. But we have the worst of the worst. Greece, south of Italy, south of Spain. So this is the picture that we have. Sorry that. So just to summarize the results that we have seen, to try to put in order what we have seen. So we have some highlights. Regions, capital regions tend to be more resilient. In general, if we use our cluster analysis, which remember is not a spatial technique, so we have regions which are categorized together simply considering if they are behaving in a similar way, independently from the fact that they are close, neighbor, or not. However, in spite we don't consider formally the vicinity, the fact they are neighbor, we see that there are some spatial patterns. So we have a sort of U-shaped pattern. In Middle Europe, so in the center of Europe, medium-high resilient regions are surrounded by resilient regions, and so on. So we have a concentric pattern in this case. Okay. Then we have what? We have that U13, which are these new member states on the right side of our figures, are more heterogeneous compared to the old member state. We see very well here. in this map on the left, we see how much homogeneous are Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, how much heterogeneous are the other countries from the Eastern Europe. So we have, and this is shown by maps based on rigorous statistical tools and analysis, but is shown also by the fact that the Moran psi that I told you varies between -1 and 1 is 0.6 for Europe as a whole. But if we take U15, this part on the left, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, France, blah, 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 we have a Moran which is equal to 0.74, so much closer to 1. If we take only the Moran psi of the U13, so this group of countries on the right side of the figure, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, blah, 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 the Moran psi is equal only to 0.13. So we cannot identify a clear spatial pattern. Okay. So this is a very important difference. Imagine in Brazil, if you have an area which is quite homogeneous and an area which is absolutely not homogeneous under a spatial point of view, the policies that you have to take are quite different. Okay. The fact that we have a high Moran psi in general and in particular for some areas means what? It means that there are regions which depend from the context in which they are. So they can gain advantage or disadvantage one reciprocally. So the externality could make that some regions are behaving well, or just because they are surrounded by other regions that are behaving well. So they are gaining comparative and competitive advantage, spillover, knowledge spillover, R&D, etc., etc. We have to consider this when we are going to do policies. So just to draw some quick conclusion from this, and then I go to the next paper, which is quicker than this. So conclusions. We have two types of conclusions here. One is methodological. Okay. And the other is about the case study and more policy oriented. So what did we do? We define a regional life cycle theory. Okay. So we created an indicator based on this new framework with this new resilient life cycle. And we are able to do what? To monitor the degree of resilience of each region, to make a taxonomy of regions according to their degree of resilience or vulnerability. But we can stress also the importance of cluster and spatial analysis in understanding these patterns. Because we are able to identify spatial patterns, but imagine that you have various years or various periods, we could be able to identify spatial temporal, space-time patterns, sorry. And then our indicator makes easy to communicate our results, even to the policymakers, making aware of them about the framework. Furthermore, having a single indicator, we can compare with this indicator with other indicators. There are yes, there is a questions about this. I finish and I reply. I finish because there is just one slide about the case study. So the case study, what do we see? First, there are national trends that dominate in some countries. There are more heterogeneous spatial trends in other countries. If we have to make policies, we have to take into account this. Capital are generally more resilient. Okay, the resilience capacity is related to the resilient capacity of the surrounding regions, other important elements. So we have limitations. This study confirms the limitations of the national level analysis. We have to favor the territorial oriented debate, or even the sectoral debate using microdata at firm level. Yes, my answer is yes. We can use, I think we can use this framework for this, or a similar one. Okay. However, we have to consider that, yes, it's true that we have to reorient our debate through our territorially oriented debate, but the national dimension still plays a role. So the common framework, legal framework, etc., is still important. So we don't have to forget national dimension, at least for some countries. About the comparability, get a look to this. If we correlate our resilience indicator with the European quality of government, the regional European quality of government monitor, what do we see? We see that the correlation is quite low, 0.36, but for EU15, so for Spain, Germany, Italy, France, blah, 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 the correlation is quite high. Institutional quality matters a lot for these countries, but doesn't matter a lot for new member states. What's the difference? What's the difference between Germany and Bulgaria? That Germany is very developed. So to maintain and to develop the resilience capacity of German regions, institutions are key. While for less developed regions, other mechanisms are in place. There is a more solo model, if you want, an increasing return of scale. If we make a comparison between the regional competitiveness index and our index, we see that the correlation is quite high. So the competitiveness of a region is one element that could be considered in order to foster resilience. And if we shift the social dimension, we see another time that in spite the correlation is quite low, it's quite high for the all member states, those more developed, and it's quite low for the less developed areas. And other times, like the quality of government, we have that for supporting resilience, we have to adopt different policies according to the level of development of the regions. Okay. So what do we need? An integrated and inclusive territorial approach in Europe. We have to target policies to deal with strengthening to stronger, to take into account heterogeneity in EU13 and national policies in EU15, macro system approach. Okay. To strengthening the heterogeneity resilient pattern. Sorry for the mistake. And we have to consider the spatial spillover. This is another important conclusion. Let's go. This is just a few slides to show you something more about this. To just explain you the snowball effect that when you set up a policy framework and a theoretical framework, you can use this framework for different types of analysis. This is another paper published in Regional Studies 2020 that looks to regional renewal. Remember, this is just a recall. Martin, 2012, identifies 4 dimensions. The fourth dimension is the renewal, the ability of a regional economy to renew its growth path. No one analyzed these elements, this dimension. So me and my co-authors, we ask ourselves, but why not trying to develop an indicator able to to account the peculiarity of this dimension. So what's the aim of our research? So we are the first that analyzed, that conceptualized, more than analyzed, empirically conceptualized the renewal. This element introduced by Martin, but no one before conceptualized this dimension. Methodologically, we use a new technique called spatial multi-level filtering technique, which we will see something about. So, what's the renewal? The capacity to renew the growth path. This is the trend. Remember, this is basically the same framework that we have seen before. We have the trend before, the trend after the shock. What is our indicator? It's very simple. It's the angle between the two trends. So, if we have a positive or negative angle difference, means that a positive difference means that the trend after the shock is higher, we have an improvement, otherwise we have a loss. What's the good point of our analysis? Is that if we are going to consider just a moment in time, we can make some welfare analysis, analyzing the welfare loss or the welfare gain due to our renewal capacity. But we will not be able to generalize because we are simply able to see just a point in time. If we are going to take on the other side a difference between these angles, so it's done. This is more, let's say, well-grounded and not dependent from just a moment in time. So this is our dependent variable. And first of all, this is our indicator. This is the map of our indicator. Sorry, here it's front. We see another time that the model psi is 0.55. There is a spatial dependence, and it is significant. So there is a spatial pattern with regions which are able to renew, to better renew with a positive angle, a positive difference between the two angles, and other regions with a negative. We see on the top left the legend. There is a core periphery. In spite, there is more heterogeneity than before, probably. To make things quick, why multi-level? Because on the left side, we have the renewal, and on the right side, we attach two kinds of variables, variables at national and variables at regional level. Following the previous literature, the average of each variable included in the vector before the crisis, let's say in the period 2000-2007. Estimation techniques. We estimated, given that we have a multi-level framework, because regions are nested within nations, within countries, we use a simple OLS with cluster standard errors at country level, then a spatial lag and spatial error model, alternatively, with cluster standard error at country level. We use also a multi-level model with country random effect, and then a spatial filtering multi-level model with country random effect. What adds the spatial filtering to our multi-level models? Basically, we are going to implement this technique that I don't go into detail, that is able to filter the residual spatial autocorrelation in the residuals. Okay, so we are able to account for what? For omitted variables, because we are adding what are called eigenvectors that are derived from the spatial weight matrix. We have a sort of surrogate of our omitted variables, so we avoid this problem. And we also filter from spatial autocorrelation. So we basically add some synthetic variables to our regressions that accounts for spatial autocorrelation and omitted variable bias. What are the data, the right-hand side variables? So we have the vector of national variables, we have the depth, which we know could be a problem if it's very high, the yield, which is the difference between the long and shorter run maturity yield. The higher the slope, the stronger the economic growth is likely to be in the future. The trade openness, so export plus import over GDP, an indicator of political stability, and an indicator of social protection, okay, which is the expenditure on on welfare, basically, over GDP. On the regional side, we have the gender difference in unemployment rate. Okay, the higher the difference, the higher is female unemployment. The patents per million of active population, innovation. Then we have specialization and diversification together. What's the idea? The idea is that a region, can be very diversified, sectorally speaking, but could be also at the same time very specialized in a single sector. So they are not mutually exclusive. They don't exclude each other. And then we have secondary education to measure human capital. What's the results? We estimated the 5 different models in order to cross-check the stability of the coefficient and the significance. We have in the 2 squares the national and below the regional variables. We see that there are some significant variables, which are the yield, which is negative and significant generally, the social protection, which is positive and significant, and not only. We will see them one by one quickly, because here probably it's not so visible. So first, social spending at national level. We have that this is quite important for renewal. So our guess, looking at the literature, is that social spending is important for the economy for a multiplier, for having a multiplier effect related to what? To consumption, but also to improving the general condition of people. So better infrastructure, better labor market condition, etc. On the other hand, we have that financial market also matter. The yield is negative to renewal, is negatively correlated to renewal. So the idea is that the higher is the slope, so the higher is the difference between the maturity, the long-term and the short-term maturity, the lower is the expected GDP growth, and choose the opportunity to renew in this case. At the regional level, we have that both diversification and specialization are positive and significant. So it means that we could have a sort of diversified specialization, regions which are differentiated, diversified within, but have some niche, some areas or a single area where they are really specialized. So they could use this specialization for gaining comparative advantage and absolute advantage, but the diversification could help being flexible to accommodate shocks. Also, the unemployment gap is important. So better, less employment for females is having a negative effect with respect to renewal. What is interesting is also saying that innovation is not working. Innovation is not working, and there is a strand of literature saying that there are some sticky or non-sticky variables. Sticky means what? Sticky means that there are some elements that are intrinsic of that regions. There are other elements that, on the other side, if things don't go very well, people go in another place. So if a multinational is investing in an area and things are not working well, multinational don't stop investing in that area. This is innovation. If things are not working well, multinational companies stop innovating in that area, and they or stop completely, or they innovate in another area. So this is one explanation of why innovation could be not, could have not significant, could be not, is not significant with respect to renewable. So some conclusion about this, some conclusion, more general conclusion about what we have seen. So Moran's I, in this case, confirms the spatial autocorrelation also for renewable. So there is a spatial part. We have that macroeconomic level conditions are very important. Very important because the international financial channel spread through countries to their financial markets. But we have also the territorial endowment, which is quite important. So we have both dimensions. From a policy perspective, we have also that government should be attentive, should take into consideration the redistribution policy, because these redistribution policies at regional level could increase wealth and could be key elements for regional renewal. Specialized diversification, we are probably to take into account an evolutionary perspective, so which is not the case of this study, but diversification and specialization at regional level are not sticky. They move in time, they change. So we would have to consider also the perspective, which is not done in these, with this data in this study. Then we have the multi-level institutional perspective to take into account. Regions belong to countries, so both are important. So institutionally, they have to work together, not against. So policies at the national level should be scaled at the regional level, taking into account the peculiarity of each region. But what about this framework? And this is the last slide for Brazil and Latin America more in general. What could we say? So we can say that the concept of resilience is flexible, and it could be adapted to specific context. Also, not only territorial context, but also specific context like the company level. Why not trying to replicate regional resilience indicator for Brazilian regions or municipality? It would be interesting for making easily communicable difficult concepts. The concept of resilience could be communicated to scientific community and to policymakers using a composite indicator. The multi-level approach, municipalities within regions in Brazil. It's important to stress the coordination between institutional level, even in Brazil or Latin America, in particular in big countries like Brazil. The importance of the spatial and cluster analysis. Why? Because it's true that regions are different from each other. And then we have to take place-based approach that are based on the characteristics of the regions. This is true, but we need a benchmark context. We need to measure the results. How can we measure the results? For example, if we know that there are some regions that are quite similar under an economic or structural point of view, we apply some different measure to different regions, and the benchmark what are the other regions which are similar, but how to identify similar regions through the spatial analysis or through the cluster analysis, or using a mix of the two. So we can use, for example, a cluster analysis, and then a spatial analysis, so identify that regions belonging to the same cluster that are close together. One can think, improve, try to use different methodologies, improving methodologies, etc. But the point is this, place-based approach, but we need to measure our results. And then we need a benchmark context. These are the tools, spatial and cluster analysis. And that's all from my side. And I thank you. And if you have any question or discussion, suggestion, I'm here for you.
Mauricio? It's me? Okay. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you very much for a very interesting and exciting presentation. I had some comments for you, just comments, but I will take the last slide as an invitation. Why don't apply the regional economic resilience indicator to Brazil? I will take it as an invitation, Nicola. We'll talk later.
Indeed, it's an invitation.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a challenge. I appreciate too much your presentation, Nicola. And I have some comments. Please feel free to work on it, make some comments inside my comments. The first I think it's empirical challenge, because when you see the literature on resilience, or even in cluster life cycle, cluster evolution, literature is quite interesting, but it's a very interesting story. It's like a storytelling agenda, research agenda, and I think there is a problem. There is a difficulty in the literature, the previous literature, to find good indicators for this issue, this subject. And that's why I think that the proposal of the regional economic resilience indicator is quite interesting. But I think there is some questions regarding the attempt to find the quantitative indicators, and then my comment in this direction. Why the literature is so difficult? Because it's hard to find the good measures. That's the problem. For example, one of the main drivers of the evolution of regions, even the resilient issues, is regarding the capabilities of local human capital, local entrepreneurs, local firms. So it's hard to find good measures to let me say, encapsulate capabilities.
Yes.
My second comment, Nicola, for you, it's the same way. Since, for example, one of the most important issues that are drivers for for example, the innovation or even the development in regions is the knowledge spillovers. Knowledge spillovers, there is a long tradition in the literature that shows the importance of the knowledge spillovers. Since Marshall studies on the industrial districts in England in the 19th century. It's very difficult to measure spillovers. For example, Some previous studies measure spillovers by citation of patents, but we know that it's not a indicator that fully got the picture of spillovers. So if we are talking about the difficulty to measure spillovers in a static, let me say, to take a picture, imagine in terms of dynamics. So what do you think about these two questions to measure, and how do you think that the indicator, the resilient indicator, make advances on that? My third and last question, not a question, Nicola, it's a comment, is regarding policy. You talk about policy in your presentation, your lecture, and I want to, if you can explore a bit little more the question of policy, because we are all agree that one size fits all policies is not adequate for any regions, even inside the European, as you said, and I completely agree that you have a high heterogeneity inside Europe. Imagine in Latin America, when first of all we are the average income is much lower, and we have very strong inequality among regions. So I completely agree that we have to advance towards place-based approach for policy. And if you can tell us more about this issue, will be very interesting.
Okay, so the first is about measurement, right, of resilience. Okay, so I think there are these questions. We could speak for one afternoon about these questions. I try to be quite synthetic. So I see the three questions, and probably another. I try to answer, to give you an answer from another perspective. What I show you, if you want, is a bit a provocation, in the sense that yes, we can identify common pattern, we can do something, but that's all? No, absolutely. If probably, if I say what I'm going to say is true for all the three consideration that you made me. Imagine that we are going to identify clusters or areas which have some commonalities, okay? The second step in my mind is going to take a couple, 2 or 3 regions for each one of these areas to try to understand what are the peculiarities. So if I'm able to characterize under a macro level perspective with aggregate data, then I could go in deep, looking carefully at what are the characteristics of these regions, of a couple of regions for each cluster, to cross-check if the clusterization that I made based on aggregate data is meaningful or not. Is it meaningful? Okay, it means that I can try to take some policies, and for that particular cluster, using the other regions as a benchmark. If it is not adequate, because I see that a region, 2 regions or 3 regions belonging to the same cluster with a qualitative analysis show that these regions are in reality are quite different, it means that my indicator and then my cluster analysis is not trustable. It means that I missed something. Okay, so it's true that it's place-based, but place-based doesn't mean that is targeted for the specificity of the municipality in that particular province, of that particular regions, blah, blah, blah. Because if you lose a general perspective, it means that you will be not able to evaluate the policies that you are going to apply to a particular case. You have to maintain a sort of general perspective, at least within the clusters. But for doing this, I have to be sure that the clusters are really working. How? With the qualitative analysis of some case studies within the cluster. Okay, and this is about policy, probably, for sure, and probably also about measurability, how to measure in part. Something more about the measures. So we can say many things here. And the first thing is that we play with the game that we have. We have these these variables, and then we have few tools for few elements for constructing indicators, blah, blah, blah. The other point is that some variables are quite reactive, some others are not. For example, employment is very reactive to the crisis. Capital is less. So in a second step of our analysis, in a chapter published in a book, Handbook of Regional Resilience, we decomposed our indicator for trying to understand which are the dimensions that weight more. And the dimension that weights more is the employment. Why? Because employment is really reactive to a shock. Okay, so the tricky point is also try to find the right variable for measuring what we want to measure. Okay, as you said, patents are not a good variable to measure innovation, not good enough. Also for resilience, it's the same. If you have to develop something, we have to use the right variables. Or a variable and the right dimensions of that variable. Because we can see the variable, the trend, the level, the delta, many ways, okay? I think that in resilience literature, there are few that are trying to exploit at the maximum this part. So exploit at the maximum the indicator, trying to find new ways of analyzing resilience, new ways of facing different aspects. There are very few authors that are focusing on this. The majority of scholars are focusing on the measures introduced by Martin in 2012, and on the right side, they add something more. I don't know, proximity to cities, infrastructural level. They try to play with the right side of the equation, not with the left side. But I think that the fundamental fact is playing with the left side of the equation, with the measure, because different measures tell you different things. With respect to innovation and spillovers, yes, I agree with you that it's a mess. It's a mess, and it's very, very, very difficult to take into account this dimension, because many innovation. I live in Italy, where there are a few big companies, a lot of small companies, family companies, which are able to really innovate, but they don't do patents because it costs too much and it's not convenient for them. They just innovate, and in the sectors, all people or companies know that they innovate, but formally they don't. This is hard, and I have no solution, honestly, for this. And I think that if you speak with colleagues from OECD, that I have contact with them, they still use patents because it's the only measurable elements that we have. But again, if we are able to consider, together with the quantitative, a bit of qualitative analysis within cluster as before, probably we could try to understand, at least, if not with statistical tools, at least qualitatively, the channels. So if we identify the channel within each one of our clusters, this is a good advance, because we know that the channels for innovation, for spillover in high resilient regions is that one, because it's coming from qualitative data. The channel for less resilient regions is another one, or there is no channel. And probably we could take some elements from that we learned from the qualitative analysis in the cluster of regions which are highly performing, for trying to reproduce something in the less performing regions. Why not? So I think we have to be a bit creative and try to go far with imagination and crossing methodologies. This is
perfect, Nicola. Sorry, Nicola.
Yes, that's all.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. Thank you very much, Nicola. I will ask you if you have some small time for two quick questions.
Yes, for sure. No, I have all the time that you need.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No time constraints.
Okay, thank you. So I will invite Larissa and Annelise. First, Larissa, to make a question for you, and then Annelise. Larissa, please.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. Your research is very interesting. I have a question from Professor Mauricio Serra. He says that you are considering resilience only from an economic perspective. He asks if you don't think that this perspective makes regional economic resilience indicator vulnerable, because a region's ability to recover from external shocks depends on a number of other factors, such as social factors, political factors, and among others. And this can impact a region's ability to recover. So if you can talk a little bit about that, thank you.
Okay, so probably the point is the following. Resilience is a broad concept. I try to focus in just a small part of that. I have been very clear. Also, when I was working at the European Commission and we developed these concepts of the resilience, another research group in parallel to me, they developed a broader concept of resilience, taking into account all the stuff that you are mentioning. The point, I said, I don't want to go too far. I prefer to be more restrictive, focusing just on a small piece. Why? For two reasons. One, because I'm an economist, So I decided on economics. But the real reason is that if you want to try to guess, to implement, to imagine some policies, you have to try to split the problem in small pieces. If you are considering too many things together, it's very difficult to find a general solution that is valid for all these small pieces of this big picture. So my idea was, I know that I'm losing some parts, some elements. I declare it at the beginning of my paper. But this is, in my opinion, one way of try to find some possible solutions. If I create a composite indicator with too many parts, all this, the faces of the social phenomenon, of the social, englobating, considering together too many things, too much difference between them. Yes, I'm showing a big map, a good map, big graphs, but and then what? And then what? Okay. So there is always in economics a trade-off. And also in this case, there is this trade-off. Then I repeat, we can take the advantages of these, as I did for the life cycle. I took this theory and I consider this theory in the context of resilience. You can take my framework, applying to another context, modifying, changing, adding elements or not. It's very flexible. But this is my point of view. I just try to restrict for this reason.
Annie?
First of all, Professor, so grateful for your presence here. Thank you very much. It's always great to listen to you and listen about your research. I have two questions. One is from Renata. She's asking if this method could be applied for a study of resilience in small and medium-sized enterprises. And another question is that if it's necessary to do the method again, if in case we are considering just one country in specific.
I start from the last. Yes, you can absolutely consider just one country. You can, so the first method is you can apply to a single country without any problems. The second method, the idea also, what you can do probably, if you have some degree of, you have states in Brazil, right? You have within Brazil, you have different states. It's called states, right, in Brazil. So if they are autonomous, if they have a certain degree of autonomy, the multi-level is about that. So you could consider, I don't know if within states there are provinces or provinces nested within states, okay? So you can absolutely apply even the multi-level approach if you have the data at a single country level. For example, in Italy, we have regions which are autonomous, and we have seen that two neighbor regions with the COVID emergency, they behave in a very, very different way. In Lombardy, where there is Milan, a disaster. In Veneto, where there is Venice, that region, perfect, no problems. So they are neighbor. So imagine how much the institutional level matters for that. Why? Because health is dealt by single region. Health is not a nation decide, something decided at national level, but is something decided by regional institutions. So there are different health policies in each one of the 20 Italian regions. Just to give you a small example with variability within a country. So imagine the provinces within each region or the provinces within each country. So absolutely yes. About the firm level. Yes, I think that, yes, it can be used. The point is finding two perspectives. Or you can look for the variables that allows you to replicate exactly the same framework at firm level, or you can adapt the framework to your context and to your variables. So the point is that, repeat, use your imagination and try to decline, to change what has to be changed in the framework to apply it to your specific context. Or even you can consider firms within provinces or within regions. What the resilience capacity of firms in function of what? In function of the characteristics of firms and of the characteristics of the context. This is very important. And there are studies also about innovation, not spillover, but innovation, company innovation that is affected by the regional context. Heavily affected. So if institutions are working well, companies innovate more in that region or vice versa. So yes, you can. You have to be rigorous but flexible, try to shape your problem according to the framework or vice versa.
Mauricio?
All right. Nicola, time is coming to finish our webinar. I would like to thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Very, very interesting. I think that we can exchange ideas later on about the application of your index here in Brazil, to compare both index, how can they talk to each other. And there are many things that we can exchange ideas. I have no doubts about this long conversation, but yes, it was a real pleasure to have you with us. And I think, and I hope that we can, this is the first time of many, many, many times that we can talk about many things. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation, for your time, everything.
So for my part, thank you again for inviting. It's always a pleasure speaking with you and sharing ideas and opinions. So thank you very much. I hope too that this is the first, this will be the first of many. I'm sure that it will be so.
I'm sure too.
Thank you, Nicola. And thank you for the audience, everybody at the YouTube transmission. Thank you very much. The transmission will be made available at our channel at the YouTube. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much again. See you soon.